Hello and welcome to this Morpheus Tech Brief on Database as a Service. I'm Martez Reed, Director of Technical Marketing with Morpheus Data. So before we delve into some of the technical aspects of trying to build out a database as a service solution leveraging the Morpheus platform, let's take the step back, really understand what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about database as a service, because it can take a number of different permutations depending upon the particular design that is utilized to fulfill the given customer need. So certainly for many, we are aware of the concept of as a service, whether that be database as a server, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. Really, the goal is to simplify or outsource the management of those particular aspects from an operational standpoint. Certainly, it also certainly applies to technology, but it does extend beyond that in which a given service may be outsourced. So as an example, you might have someone else that cuts your grass or a delivery driver that brings a particular good. Those are essentially as a service mechanisms. So in the case of database as a service, really want to focus on really two differentiators or two types, really focused on the self-managed database versus the managed database. So as we see here on this slide, number of aspects from a self-managed database standpoint. This could be a number of areas that also include leveraging IaaS and then building on top of that. If you are leveraging a cloud environment or services from a cloud provider, in which they are taking care of management, the care and feeding of the underlying infrastructure components. So typically that's going to bring all the way up to the virtualization layer, which is what we see here on the left side of the self-managed. Certainly, if it is a on-prem environment or a self-managed environment from an infrastructure standpoint, the layers all the way down would be the responsibility of the customer. Uh, whether that be an enterprise that is building out their own database as a service solution for internal teams within the organization, or from the service provider's standpoint, in which they're responsible for managing that underlying infrastructure and providing that as a service to their customers. Ultimately, in this case, the end user or consumer of the particular resource or service would be responsible for facilitating the installation and configuration and ongoing management of that database in the self-managed scenario. In the case of a managed database, this is where the ongoing care and feeding and management of the database itself, whether that be MongoDB, Postgres, SQL Server for Microsoft, that component has been offloaded to a provider, whether it be a cloud service provider or to an internal team that is now responsible for managing and maintaining that aspect, but delivering it as a service model to the end user or consumer of the database as a service. Certainly, there's a number of other variations as it relates to database as a service, some that we've seen from the major hyperscalers, such as the concept of things like serverless databases, in which many of the underlying aspects from a database engine standpoint have been abstracted even further, in which you're not selecting things like the specific version of Postgres or MySQL or variants or flavors from a configuration standpoint as it relates to even the database engine. At that point, you're simply provided with a mechanism by which to populate data into the database and then retrieve information from the database. So at that point, it's another higher level abstraction that's added on top. Certainly, all of them have their pros and cons. Typically, from a self-managed database standpoint, the trade-off is going to be you are responsible for managing the database, but the pro that many organizations see is the level of control that they have over how the database is configured, how the database is managed to align with common operational practices within their organization, as well as specific application requirements that may require certain things to be fine-tuned specific to their application. In the case of the managed database, certainly one of the benefits becomes not having to worry about handling all of the various aspects from a database management standpoint, such as installation, configuration, updating, patching, all the things that come along with owning and managing a system in an environment. The trade-off becomes, to the point that I was mentioning earlier, is that there's less control from an end user or end customer standpoint, in that they have to align with what the service provider has decided are the appropriate options that are available to them as a customer. Additionally, given that it is being delivered as a service, and one of the benefits is that somebody else is handling all the care and feeding, there typically is an additional charge or premium tied to the delivery of that service, as opposed to if you were to go down the path of managing the database yourself. Certainly that becomes a trade-off and a consideration in terms of the economics of whether it makes sense to manage the database yourself or pay a few extra dollars, so to speak, to have somebody else take care of that care and feeding of the particular database. So now that we've got a good understanding of database as a service, let's take a look at ways in which the Morpheus platform can be leveraged to be able to build out such a solution that simplifies the capabilities for the end customer or end user, whoever that might be. So one of the major use cases of the Morpheus platform is the ability to be able to orchestrate the infrastructure provisioning process. So certainly one of the first things that is going to have to be done in terms of delivering a database as a service solution is that there's the need to perform the initial installation and configuration of the database. So as an example, Morpheus platform could be leveraged to provision an Ubuntu instance or virtual machine, whether that be in one of the on-prem hypervisors that the platform supports, such as VMware, OpenStack, Nutanix, Hyper-V, as well as a handful of others. And then additionally, the public clouds, such as AWS, Azure, GCP, Oracle, and a handful of others there. So that would provide the ability to be able to provision the Ubuntu instance. So in that case, we're getting up to the operating system itself. Certainly, the platform provides the ability to be able to handle the additional infrastructure provisioning tasks that are necessary in many organizations, such as reserving an IP, creating a DNS record, all those very crucial things from an operational standpoint. But once the operating system has been provisioned and ready to go, that then provides us the ability to be able to start fine-tuning and installing additional components onto that system, such as logging agents, monitoring agents, security agents, and then finally installation and configuration of Postgres itself from the platform standpoint. So at which point that would provide us the ability to be able to orchestrate that end-to-end process of provisioning an instance, leveraging the Morpheus platform. So let's take a look at some of those pieces and components within the Morpheus platform and how we can build those up leveraging various constructs. So as an example, one of the things I want to do is be able to integrate with the various clouds and then orchestrate that process. So we're not going to walk through every single aspect in excruciating detail, but do want to touch on many of the key components that are leveraged to build out such a capability. So there would be things like node types, layouts, instance types. That would provide us the mechanism to be able to provision an instance into a given cloud, whether that be on-prem or in the public cloud. And then what we then want to leverage is the platform's automation capabilities to tie into that process to orchestrate the installation and configuration of the database, as an example. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at a catalog item and then deconstruct that and see how all the components fit together. So in this case, I've got a PostgreSQL database in this particular example. Few of the things that I've exposed to the end user or end customer are things like the database engine version, a plan size, password for the Postgres database, and then maintenance window to be able to specify when it is applicable or allowed for upgrades or patching to be completed for this particular system. So in this case, I've specified that there are 3 different versions available from a Postgres database standpoint, the database engine itself, that the user can select from: Postgres 15, 14, and 13. Certainly could be any of the various versions that are available that can be deployed. And then I have a plan. So in this case, 2 plan sizes could be expanded to even more. But in this case, I've specified that I want to allow 1 vCPU, 1 gig of RAM, and a 10 gig solid state disk. And then additionally, 2 vCPU, 4 gigs of RAM, and then 40 gig of solid state disk. And then specifying that a password be provided for the Postgres database user. And then, as I said, a maintenance window being associated for this particular system. So in this case, this allows a end user to be able to come into the platform, order what it is that they need. In this case, it is a Postgres database from the Morpheus platform. So let's start to walk through all the components that are leveraged to build out this particular catalog item that we see in the Morpheus platform. So we come to Library Blueprints, take a look at catalog items. So in this case, we see that we have our Postgres SQL database. So filled out a few pieces of information. So let's take a look at the variables or the inputs that we saw from the catalog item standpoint. So we saw that we had the version, the service plan, the password, and the maintenance window from the platform's standpoint. So those are going to provide us the ability to be able to inject those components or those variables into the particular instance type or instance layout from the platform standpoint to be able to inject that during the provisioning of this particular system. So let's take a quick look at those inputs to see what they look like. So as I said, we have the version, which ties in this case to a select list or option list within the platform that will present the various options that we saw, which was Postgres 15, 14, and 13. In this case, it is a static list that backs this particular item. So as we see here, Postgres 15, 14, and 13. And that's going to be passed into the automation to configure and install the specific version of Postgres that the user has selected as part of the deployment. Also have a few other inputs that we saw. So we also saw service plan. So let's take a look at that. In this case, similar to as we saw with the version, that it maps to a database as a service plans option list. So in this case, once again, another manual option list, and then we're simply mapping it to a service plan within the Morpheus platform that is associated with the 1 vCPU, 1 gig of RAM, 10 gig solid state disk, and then similarly for the other plan that is presented as part of this option list. The other one is the password, which is just a password input type, which I can then grab and then pass into from an option list or option input standpoint. So that provides me the ability to be able to take the user input, be able to associate it with the catalog item, and then subsequently pass it into my automation from that standpoint. So let's take a look at the instance type for this particular system. Nothing extraordinarily complex here. Really just a standard Morpheus instance type mapping into a standard Morpheus instance layout. And then we also see that in this case, we are associating the database as a service workflow with this particular instance layout to facilitate the installation and configuration of MongoDB, or not MongoDB, apologize, with PostgreSQL. So if we come to automation and workflows, we can see the database as a service workflow. In this case, we do have an Ansible playbook that is associated to install PostgreSQL within the Morpheus platform. And so that particular task is mapped into an Ansible playbook that is then executed to be able to install and configure PostgreSQL for this particular instance. And so that would also be the similar mechanism that would be leveraged to install things like the monitoring agent, the logging agent, the security agent. Configure the system appropriately in alignment with the specific requirements that have been defined for the database to stay in lockstep with what customers are expecting and need from the database as a service solution. So if we come back to provisioning and catalog, we'll go ahead and order one of the items. Postgres 14. And then we'll click order now. So at which point it's going to go away and start iterating through the actual provisioning process for this system. Since I do have an existing instance, let's take a look at an existing instance that's been deployed into this environment. So in this case, the instance has been deployed. There's a couple of things that have been added to this particular system. So certainly out of the box, the Morpheus platform includes a number of capabilities to be able to manage a given system that has been deployed, provide some visibility, configuration, and capability within the platform itself. But one of the things that I do want to touch on is the Morpheus platform's plugin architecture that does allow extensibility for specific use cases. And as an example, in this particular case, the custom UI tab capability within the Morpheus platform allows me to be able to add additional information to a particular instance to provide specific context for that instance. And so what I mean by that is something like a database as a service solution. I might want to be able to expose the connection details for the database in a readily and easily to consume fashion in which the user or customer could come into the Morpheus platform and click on their particular deployed workload and then get information on how to quickly connect into that database. So in this particular scenario, we do see that there is a connection details tab on this particular system. So in this case, this is a custom UI tab that has been created to be able to provide information and details in regards to the database. So certainly this is an example. So one of the things we do see is that the password is in plain text. With the custom UI tabs, this section of the UI is fully extensible in that it can be defined leveraging CSS, JavaScript, HTML. And so I could have the ability to be able to leverage something like JavaScript and then be able to hide the password until a button is clicked to view the password. Once again, a number of capabilities from an extensibility standpoint that it provides to be able to address specific use cases in a manner that is conducive to how a given organization wants to handle that from a functionality standpoint. But in this case, once the workload is provisioned, I can quickly come into this section of the Morpheus UI and then be able to see the information that I need to connect to this database. Once again, looking to provide that ease of use and functionality for customers when they come into the platform to be able to request that database, but also be able to quickly interact with the database from that standpoint. So certainly, this could be an area where there's additional functionality that's added from a connection details standpoint to toggle on various different ways in which to present this information or allow things like copy and paste of a connection string or username and password. Certainly, the options are essentially endless in terms of how it can be presented and be exposed to really drive that from a functional standpoint. One of the things I do want to touch on is take a bit of a look at how this particular instance tab was constructed to really see the power of the plugin architecture, but also in many ways, the ease in which something like this can be created or replicated. So let's take a look In this case, we're going to jump into Visual Studio Code and take a look at the connection details. So from a plugin architecture standpoint, the Morpheus platform includes the ability to be able to install custom plugins. Plugins include what are known as providers. So providers are really the functional mechanism that we're looking to achieve within the platform. So as an example, a instance tab provider or instance UI tab provider, or a backup integration provider, or a custom report integration provider. So that's the mechanism that we want to tie into. In this case, we want to leverage the instance tab provider to be able to add that additional tab to the database as a service instance that we saw. So not going to dig too deep into all of the code, but do want to point out a few things from a functional standpoint to be able to build out this capability. So in this case, we're going to grab the information about the instance. So that's what we see here with the render template. We're also going to expand on that configuration to grab additional details about the instance that we want to be able to leverage. So as an example, one of the things that we saw was on the host or the host name for this particular system, as well as leveraging that host name within the connection string for this database. So in this case, we are leveraging the instance as well as the instance details in this case. So the payload that was passed and then the payload that was expanded on to concatenate the host name as well as the domain name. Certainly, there's a number of ways in which this can be constructed to be able to provide that information, whether it's a DNS name or IP address or whatever the connection mechanism may be. Really, we just want to grab some information to leverage and display that to the user when they come into the platform. And so we're going to add that into our model or our map in this case. And then we're going to pass that into the object that is going to get passed into the rendering. And so as I mentioned, what we saw from the connection details tab, that is HTML that is being generated. And so we are going to look to pass in information during the rendering of that HTML. So in that case, we want to pass in instance-specific information, which in this case is the host name plus the particular domain name. So we got a question. If we talk about database as a service, examples about multiple database instances on same machines and not displaying connection details only. So in the case, this particular scenario, we're walking through a one-to-one mapping of a database to a server. Certainly, it is possible leveraging things like XaaS within the Morpheus platform to be able to build out functionality in which you may want multiple databases on a single server. In this case, I do not have an example of that in this tech brief, but certainly something that is possible within the Morpheus platform. Great question. And so we're rendering the database as a service connection details for this particular workload. And so this is going to map into the file that is being rendered. And so in this case, we see that we have some HTML that is being displayed. And so we see, in this case, as I said, an example, this could be parameterized or variabilized, in which we could do something like grab this information from Cypher and populate it into the actual rendering of this particular HTML page. But one of the things we are doing is grabbing that host. And so that was the instance name plus the domain for this particular workload. And then we're populating that into this particular HTML page. Then we're also defining the string for the connection string. So certainly a number of ways to be able to expand on this to make it much more dynamic and be able to express or visualize the desired information in a number of different ways. But really the goal is to be able to showcase ways in which this information can be presented to the end user or end customer. And so that's leveraging the mechanism that we see here from a visualization standpoint. So that provides us or the user with the information to be able to connect into the database within the Morpheus platform itself. So at which point the database has been installed, it's configured, it's ready to go and start being leveraged within the Morpheus platform. Let's take a look at some other ways in which we can extend from a platform standpoint. So I got a question. For MSPs, how is architecture of database as a service in multi-tenants? Deployment options from a service provider side. So in the case of a MSP, it'd be similar mechanism from a platform standpoint, in which what we saw there from the Postgres database standpoint, that particular catalog item could be exposed down into a subtenant from the Morpheus platform, similar to various other instance types within the Morpheus platform. Really, it's focused on being able to facilitate the automated installation and configuration of that system, and then be able to provide the ability to be able to manage that on an ongoing basis. Monitoring is certainly one of the things that is key from a solution standpoint to be able to facilitate the monitoring of the particular system, whether that be things like CPU, memory, storage, database connections, things of that nature. So as an example, once again, leaning into the plugin architecture and capability of the Morpheus platform, certainly the platform includes some basic monitoring functionality out of the box, but oftentimes there is a desire to leverage an external or third-party solution and then tie that into the Morpheus platform. So that's where something like a Prometheus or Datadog or Dynatrace or OpsRamp could be leveraged to be able to integrate and be able to provide additional information and context within the Morpheus platform for that particular system. So many that might be familiar with things like the Datadog plugin that is available on share.morpheusdata.com. A similar mechanism in which there's the ability to be able to tie in that external monitoring and visibility information into the Morpheus platform. So here's another example of a custom tab that has been created to be able to visualize information from a third-party monitoring system to be able to provide visibility from a platform standpoint to tie in to that third-party system. So certainly a number of ways to be able to present this, visualize this from a platform standpoint to be able to showcase the functionality within the Morpheus platform. So we have a couple of questions that came in, such as OS lifecycle management. So in the case of managing the operating system, that's where the platform's ability to be able to execute things like automation. So those things like those Ansible playbooks that we leveraged from a installation and configuration standpoint, whether it be that, a bash script, shell script, whatever it might be from a functional standpoint, can leverage those mechanisms within the Morpheus platform to be able to orchestrate that ongoing management process, whether that be the OS patching or even the actual database patching itself from a maintenance standpoint. So not included out of the box with the Morpheus platform, but being able to leverage the capabilities of the platform to be able to run those ad hoc or on a scheduled basis, provides a mechanism by which to automate that process on behalf of a customer. So we have a question about, can metering be set for database metrics only? So within the platform, that would be something that could be added to a service plan as an example. So the ability to be able to define something like a price for something like a software or a service within the platform, in which you could specify that I want to add something like, let's say, enhanced monitoring or more detailed monitoring. And there is an additional charge or cost for that particular service add-on. That'd be the ability to be able to associate that with the given plan that the user may select. So that way, when they select the given item, that they know they are taking an additional premium service or purchasing an additional premium service as part of it. Great question. So we got another question. Can we implement database as a service for MS SQL and Oracle easily? So certainly it's all going to vary on the nuance of the service that you're looking to provide. So MS SQL or Oracle as a mechanism from a database standpoint isn't widely or wildly different than some of the things we've walked through from a Postgres standpoint. So it's really looking at how you're going to orchestrate that installation and configuration, and as well as what you're going to expose from a service standpoint. So really it's the many of the same mechanisms that we've taken a look at in terms of building out that service and then just replicating that for the specific database that needs to be built out. Great question. Let's take a look back at our database instance. So as I said, we have the additional information being pulled in to be able to visualize from a performance and metric standpoint. In addition to what we see here from the native Morpheus functionality that's being displayed. So certainly a number of options in which to be able to bring in that information and that data. In the Datadog plugin, as I mentioned, there's also the additional aspects of that in which you can add in a button to be able to facilitate the integration with even the native portal of an existing solution, such as a Datadog or a Grafana, whatever it might be, to provide some pared down specific contextual information, and then also be able to present to an additional UI or platform the visibility in a more granular, detailed way. So this question, can Dynatrace be added as a plugin? So certainly the plugin architecture does support the functionality to be able to tie into many of those various solutions that I mentioned. And one of the examples that I mentioned was that Datadog plugin that is available on share.morpheusdata.com. Certainly that could be utilized as a model for ways in which to add a Dynatrace plugin. But in many ways, it's going to be specific to the use case. But yes, that can be added. All right, so we've taken a look at a number of the various aspects from a platform standpoint as it relates to orchestrating the installation and configuration of the database, as well as ways in which to be able to extend the functionality from a number of different areas within the Morpheus platform, whether that be adding in the ability to simplify the user's experience for connecting to the database with the connection details, also being able to provide additional visibility into performance and utilization of the database, leveraging the platform's ability to be able to tie into third-party monitoring solutions via the plugin architecture to be able to pull that into the Morpheus platform itself. And then also talked about some various ways in which the ongoing management of the system could be automated, leveraging the platform's automation hooks into various different automation tooling, and then the ability to be able to schedule that on a recurring basis. So certainly want to thank everyone for the time and appreciate the questions.